Labor is taxed fairly intensively. But when you look at resources, they're not taxed. So when you look at how we then use labor and resources, then we use resources rather frivolously. They're cheap compared to labor, which we are stingy about using. So when companies start operating, they take that into account, the relative price of factors, and they're saying, well, we can just use resources because they're relatively cheap. The labor side of things, oh my God, let's be careful with that. And the connect to the circular economy is oftentimes when you want to be efficient, resource efficient, not economy efficient, but resource efficient, it has a fairly high component of labor involved. You straddle with the problem of saying, well, what makes private sector, what drives the private sector, and it's money, right? It's profit, right? That is a major driver, and sustainability, was oftentimes considered a cost center.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. In this podcast, we explore the chances to decarbonize the healthcare sector. It's brought to you by Green Innovation Group. We're a management consulting firm, and all we do is working on decarbonizing the healthcare sector. Today, we're going to talk about quantifying sustainability. Why is this relevant? Well, if we do want to have sustainable development, we need to be able to properly measure and access a way to benchmark the results and the plans that we have in place. And in order to take that discussion to the next level, I have invited Kristoffer to come and have this conversation with us in the studio. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast with Kristoffer Hvidsten. Hello and welcome to the show, Kristoffer.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing me in. I do appreciate it. It's on a topic that I'm very passionate about.
Definitely, and it seems like you can't, every time we do something together, you can't help it but sort of going into the quantification, so I'm really excited to have this conversation.
It's a liability I have. I'm an economist by trade, and I love numbers.
It's an occupational hazard.
Occupational hazard, exactly.
Chris, for those of our listeners who don't know you, who are you?
I recently labeled myself as the marathoner of sustainability. I've been doing it for 25 odd years. Sustainability, it's a marathon, not a sprint. You see change, but slowly, and it's a challenge where anybody who's done a marathon would probably recognize the aspect, which is, can I even do it? Will this happen? How will I do it? And in that sense, driving sustainability has some similarities to you challenging yourself to do a marathon. Are you able to do it? Is part of the question that you're asking, and I think a lot of us in the field are asking ourselves, how can we move this agenda? When will we reach some of those goals that we've been working on for quite some time?
But also that need to pace yourself. You've talked a lot about that. It's if we go through the marathon metaphor, you can't really afford to sprint the first couple of kilometers.
Well, you run out of steam for sure, right? So how do you run a marathon? Well, you bite it into pieces, and that's I think a key lesson actually that you're not going to get there in a day or in 2 days. You got to pace yourself, and you got to set yourself targets, goals that are attainable. That maybe you reach or stretch goals, but still something that will keep you focused, keep you motivated in terms of seeing, well, we can get to impact. Perhaps not what I dreamt about in the first instance, but we're moving along the way.
And during this journey, there's kind of a couple of sort of cliffhangers I can throw out to the audience now. That you did your first carbon accounting exercise around 1993.
Something like that.
Crazy. We met each other the first time, I believe, 6 years ago, whilst you were working at Accenture, and recently you've tried your luck with entrepreneurship. If we had to go through those 3 points, sort of rapid fire mode, I mean, I was 5 when you did your first carbon accounting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating when you look at the science and you're like, well, this is obvious, right? At that point, even at that point, it's kind of obvious. But I was part of the team doing the national accounting in Denmark, the green accounting, and we linked economic activity to emissions to the air to understand how that interplayed. And that was still early days. It was a research
project. It's gotta be pioneering.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it was pioneering at the time. It's a research project funded by the Rockwool Foundation at that point, but fascinating to see that how economic activity is linked very directly to and how it's linked to. So sitting there and matching emission factors with economic activity was gratifying as an economist. You got your numbers and then things add up and etc. So
yeah, and it's also that's what really fascinates me about sort of CO2 equivalents, that at the end of the day, it fits into the Excel sheet. It's just a new sort of you could actually call it a valuta, right? That it's
it's a currency. I mean, it's becoming more and more so, right? It's becoming it's one of the things within the realm of sustainability that is the most readily available to let's say quantify and commodify even. But look at it. We're not there yet. We can't agree on what's the pricing is going to be like. We're still working on the methods to measure it. How do we do the scopes? How do we divide the labor, etc. And yet it is still one of the realms of sustainability where it lends itself really, really well to be quantified.
And I think that's actually the beauty of it, that you have CO2 equivalents, and you can convert that relatively easy. But you'd say the same thing with dollars or euro, that then there's a cost structure behind it. Then there's a timing, there's cash flow issues, liquidity issues, all of these different structures that also kind of in a similar vein makes it possible to second guess the value of a currency like the dollar or the euro. Whereas with the CO2e, the challenges are somewhat different, that a lot of the times it's about sort of the scoping issues, what's inside and outside of scope when we do those calculations and such. But if we fast forward then from me being 5 years old to me being much, much older and us running into each other whilst you were at Accenture, one thing that stood out, of course, was that you had an amazing beard. I think that was really impressive. But another thing was that I remember you talking a lot about the circular economy. So what got you into the circular economy?
Well, I think it's when you try to combine. I mean, when you're faced with the challenge of sustainability in the private sector in particular, where the societal value of certain things are not priced in. When the opportunity cost of doing something is not priced in, when the shadows prices are not sort of clearly defined, you straddle with the problem of saying, well, what makes private sector, what drives the private sector, and it's money, right? It's profit, right? That is a major driver, and sustainability, at that point in time was oftentimes considered a cost center, right? Yeah. So how much do you want to move into this cost center that is sustainability? I mean, do you want to make to try and make sure that your supply chain is free of child labor, say? How much audit should you do? What kind of standards do you want to put in? So it's very much revolving around a cost center. Now, that to the private sector is not a hugely attractive
it's
proposition.
It's a poor value offering, right?
It's not something that's on top of your list, and not something that would lead you to perhaps invest a lot in it. Because
I'll fix a problem you don't care about, but it's going to be really expensive.
Yes. It'll cost you money for sure.
Yeah.
And maybe there's an upside somewhere. You'll be a good you'll be a good citizen if you do it. Yeah. And I think what the circular economy sort of offered was to say, well, listen, the way that we've been the way the economic system has evolved has been hugely wasteful. So we have in the quest to be quick to market, in the quest to deliver efficiently, it's become part and parcel of your business model that there's a lot of waste. It could be if we take agriculture as an example, on the field, estimates vary. 30% of the output is lost because you're using too much fertilizer, too much pesticides. You're not growing in the right way. If you go to then manufacturing, very few manufacturing operations run. Oftentimes in your mind, you're like you have two inputs and then you make an output. Well, the reality is you have two inputs and then there's a manufacturing process that takes place. And
it looks a lot like reality, actually, and life. That then all kinds of monkey business starts happening the moment they set those assembly lines in process, right?
All kinds of things happen. And I think with the exception of the oil and gas sector, which hasn't, you have a label for this. It's called operational equipment efficiency. So it's a measure for how much you put in and how much you get out. And are you running your machines all the time, or is there downtime for repair, etc.? They operate at something like 90+%, but they're the exception. Mm-hmm. Most industries operate at something like 50 to 60%, meaning that 40 to 50%, 50 to 40% of the time, you're actually not being productive. It's wasted. Most people are perhaps familiar with the sort of the food waste issue, right? So even when you get all the way to the consumer, well, you have to buy in certain quantities and planning can be difficult and whatnot, and you end up maybe wasting something like 30-40% of the food that you purchase. Now, nobody is getting value out of that. It's just waste. So the circular economy is really saying, okay, let's target those different bins of waste and activate those, because there we can actually save costs, for example, or we can increase more revenue by getting more output. So it's trying to square that circle, square because we're in the economy side of things. So you want to square that, and you want to try and drive out costs by being more efficient, let's say, or drive revenues by having more output, and that is in line with the private sector agenda.
The funny thing is, if we take sort of political lingo into this, then we have circular economy. It says economy, that's great. We want economy. Circular, okay, but it's in front of economy. Great, let's go. But then one thing that has always sort of bothered me in a way, or just made me really curious, is how efficiency that really has sort of it commands a certain amount of respect in a corporate lingo, that you want to be efficient, right? That resource efficiency somehow doesn't really play into that, and I think that's really curious when you then look at sort of the resilience in your supply chain. When you have a high degree of efficiency, it just makes you way more independent and way more resilient if you have a pandemic or you have a war in Russia or something. That the higher degree of independency that you have, quite often you will also be more sustainable. It's not a one-to-one, but I just think it's really interesting that sort of efficiency word hasn't really cut through, that sustainability entered the corporate stage as a checkbox exercise, that it was a lot of window dressing, and then we have a CSR policy, and that's great. But what's really curious to me is that it just looks like a massive business opportunity that everyone has just skipped on until quite late.
Yeah, I would agree, but I would also disagree to the extent that being an economist, there is a lot of micro decision that goes into running a company, that goes into manufacturing and so on. And I think fundamentally people try to make good decisions all along the way. And what at the end of the day drives the economy is what dictates what you do. So if speed to market supersedes you making sure you're not losing certain resources, then that might be a superior choice. in that microcosm where you have to make that decision, we need to get to market fast. So in that process, we'll lose a little more of the resources, but the trade-off is fine. And I think, to me, sort of why I ventured into being in the circular economy myself and what I've experienced there, it is really about, well, we've actually designed, and I think Denmark is a very nice sort of textbook example, is when you look at labor. Labor is taxed fairly intensively. But when you look at resources, they're not taxed. So when you look at how we then use labor and resources, then we use resources rather frivolously. You know, they're cheap compared to labor, which we are stingy about using. So when companies start operating, they take that into account, the relative price of factors, and they're saying, well, we can just use resources because they're relatively cheap. The labor side of things, oh my God, let's be careful with that. And the connect to the circular economy is oftentimes when you want to be efficient, resource efficient, not economy efficient, but resource efficient, it has a fairly high component of labor involved. Yeah. Because you need a human interaction to save some of those situations. Oftentimes, when things go wrong in manufacturing, it's a machine malfunctioning, and you have not yet designed a system that can capture and stop all that. So you need some human interaction. So you know, by and large, you have a response in the private sector that is driven by the relative price factors. Resources are cheap. Let's just, you know, keep the engine going and be economically efficient, not resource efficient.
And you have some first-hand experience here because you had a company that would take old laundry machines and old washing machines, dishwashers, etc., and refurbish them and sell them again. And one of the lessons you learned was that repair labor was extremely expensive. Oh yeah. Especially if it had to be in a high quality compared to just buying new washing machines, which would.
I mean, the way that we've structured how we're using resources in the world, our economic structures, makes it much more competitive to just build new. Yeah. I mean, you sort of real. I mean, it was large household appliances, and I think some people, if they've ever experienced the problem, let's say with their washing machine, some will just go out and buy new. Fine, but there are those that would sort of check, you know, how much would it cost for somebody to fix it? You know, what's even wrong? Because we don't know. It just, you know, gives you an error code, F91, not very helpful. And you kind of wonder, why is it so unhelpful? Maybe it's by design. Who knows? So you got to figure out first what's wrong with it, and then you can ask, you know, a repair guy. And they would typically say something in the neighborhood, we can come and have a look. And for sure, you'll be paying us upwards of 800 kroner to come visit you. And we will also have you know, and I think this is an important part, they have you know, the likelihood of us being able to repair it is, you know, we don't guarantee anything. So what you know for sure is it's gonna cost you some money. Will it fix your problem? Probably not. I mean, not for sure. You don't know. And if you're going to fix the problem, they will probably, and they will also tell you, there will be a price tag, an additional price tag. And then you're looking into spending at a minimum 800, probably more, let's say 1,500. And you can actually get, albeit a cheap, but you can get a new washing machine for that amount.
Yeah, and that would be comparatively 100 euro, 200 euro to just go through that.
100, 200 euros just to go through the process of trying to repair it, and you don't know for sure that you'll get an end result.
Yeah, and there's no tax reward, there's nothing from a societal level that should create that incentive for the consumer to actually go out and do that.
It would, to be frank, be a little bit irrational to have your machine repaired. Yeah. Now we were aware of that, and then what we did is we collected the machines in a factory sort of setup to have, you know, to be efficient around the repair. So it would cost less to do it. But it's just to say that the current structures are not set up for repair. And to do repair, you absolutely need human interaction. And it's one of the most expensive things in most Western societies is having labor and qualified labor to do your work. And
it was also a point for you not to ship it off to Eastern Europe and get cheap labor up to Denmark to execute it.
That was part of the point. Is we felt, because we were built on values first, that a local for local approach in terms of transport, in terms of industry, etc. It would make sense to do it local for local. And it's also a question of what we're experiencing. I mean, the end game of trade is that you equalize prices and wages, etc. So at the end of the day, we're going to have seamstresses in Denmark at some point. It's not there yet. Still cheaper to go to Burma and Myanmar and whatnot, to Portugal to do stuff. But as things equalize, at the end of the day, we'll end up with having production ourselves. So there was some values going into those decisions, but it was very clear that we ended up having a minimum price point of something like €300 per machine to break even. Yeah. Now that's not cheap at all. It's also a very unique product we had. We had the only circular large household appliances on the market, and we managed to convince 1,100 customers that it was the right choice. And mostly you might ask yourself, why would they do that? Well, we could offer high quality machines at a very low cost. So that was the value proposition, that you could access some machines that maybe would be out of your range at ordinary prices, but as a repaired unit, it was affordable. Yeah. So that's why a lot of people got in, and then of course we had a green segment who just felt it was the right thing to do. Yeah.
And that's also one of the things we talk a lot about in Green Innovation Group, that we actually need for the sustainable transition and the green transition to be independent of this moral inclination to do things because they're the right things to do, but because the processes are just making it inherently easier and more rational to go that path. Just like you said, it would actually not be a very rational decision to get your machinery or your appliances repaired at home as a private citizen. And I think that's a huge problem. When we're talking about quantifying sustainability, and you've been in this space since forever, you're literally one of the grand old men in the space, but what's the development you've seen in terms of quantifying the actual sustainability?
Well, I think what we've seen is that for the first sort of part of the 90s, we saw a lot of pioneers, going out, doing stuff, and then reporting on it, or telling the world, communicating to the world what we've done. So we've done this in the supply chain, or we've done this on energy, or we've done that on climate and whatnot. And I think that had its period.
It was kind of also a free-for-all, right? That you could go out and do something, you could claim that it was great or sustainable or something, and there wasn't sort of a systematic approach to scrutiny like that.
No, and I think the first frustration started when people sort of it was the second wave sort of came when you saw those that went out and tried to do something. Actually, it became apparent that they stuck their neck out. They were the first. They were the first in line to be criticized. The ones that didn't do anything, they stayed in the shadows, if you will, and weren't criticized. But the ones that actually tried to take steps, measurable steps towards doing this, were also the first one out of the gate gets bloodied, right? Yeah. So they took the hits early on, and the response to that is sort of saying, well, okay, then what does good look like? How can we get some more certainty? And then you saw sort of a whole. And it was the response came mainly from the private sector. So you would see something like FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, coming out and saying, well, we can provide a set of standards for you to apply if you want to harvest natural forests. If you want to do timber, we can provide you with some certainty that the methods that's been used, etc., has been are sustainable or more sustainable. So you saw an upcrop. You saw it with responsible palm oil as well. So you saw a lot of private initiatives.
Also MSC, right, for fishing.
You saw MSC for fishing coming along because private sector reacts to see, there's some people are buying that, so let's do more of it, and it seems to have some kind of effect in terms of providing some level of assurance. So you saw some very specific sectors coming up with these standards, but you also saw initiatives like you would. That would be sort of more based around, for example, climate. You see the CDP coming up, the Climate Disclosure Project, for example, coming up with standards. But people coming together in different partnerships to try and develop some kind of rules of the game, because there were not. At least from a public standpoint, not a lot of. There were some ISO standards coming up as well, but the sort of the common agreement on how to measure these things were still up for grabs, and I think we have now entered the third phase, if you will.
Yeah. So is this also what you see as the stage where, like, fair trade, Maxeola, organic branding, these kind of things start standing out?
Those are along the same line. They're sort of so there's a lot of innovation in the private sector, and here you find a lot of innovation around trying to provide some kind of certainty for users and for consumers and for businesses in terms of saying, what does it mean? So fair trade comes up with a suggestion. There is a problem around how you treat labor in your supply chain. So are people getting a fair shake? Okay, we'll come up with a set of standards, and we'll come up with some audit procedures and whatnot to make that happen. And we've seen there's a whole industry around this, and it provides some level of assurance, but it is also private sector driven, and to be
interesting. If we take like the fair trade example, is something I believe most of our listeners will be able to relate to. Right. I mean, we all remember sort of it coming into our lives probably, and seeing it being more and more prevalent. But I suppose one of the issues is that it has kind of been viewed as a free choice in the market, that you as a consumer make your choice. Do you want the cheap chocolate, or do you want the high morale chocolate? And not as an industry standard as such, because I believe if all coffee and chocolate was produced by fair trade standards, we would see a very different coffee and chocolate industry. Sure. But a lot of the purchases into these areas, also for FSC and MSC, are made by someone who's also purchasing the rest. So would you argue there's a little bit of a last man standing strategy going on as well in sort of allowing for this to remain open?
I think I would phrase it like this. There's a sort of a political vacuum here, or sort of a political divide. So we see playing out in different shapes and forms. But because you could very reasonably argue, why should there be commodities on offer in Denmark, for example, or in the Western, in any country, that does not sort of. Why should there be slave labor or child labor in that commodity? Why is that a decision I should make, whether to avoid that? I mean, you could argue that that should not take place. I mean, you should edit that out. You should not put that on the shelves. So absolutely, there's not been sort of a way to shape that politically, at least, in terms of saying, well, we will not allow that. That's going to be a trade barrier. Mm-hmm. if you actually supply us with these inputs with this that has these characteristics, we're not going to allow it in our market. So it's been to private initiative, and a private initiative, I think, is looking at consumers and saying, what do you want? And some feel it's important and will choose it, and private industry say, hey, if we can get a premium, why not?
let's take that premium.
Yeah, let's take that premium.
And an interesting part of it is also that it's kind of been, okay, so we will certify you and prove that you're not taking advantage of slave labor or child labor at a cost, because it's not free to get that certification. And then other chocolate producers will say, well, we're not paying for the certification. And then the consumer can say, but then how can I be sure? And they can say, well, because we say so. And then we have that whole new element of trust where if it was in reverse and they said, we guarantee you that we use child labor and slave labor in it, then the EU, of course, would not allow for it to be imported if it was blatant. So it's also interesting that we're not allowing for certain moral aspects to be there out in the open, but we are allowing for others to sort of
And you, to be honest, we do live in a complex world. When you do go, as I've gone to do these audits in the supply chains, you're often confronted with situations where, child labor it's not because the children likes to work or the family think it's advantageous. They didn't want to put the children to school. It's because what are the alternatives? I mean, what as a family in poverty. They've not chosen that poverty, but they're living in poverty, and you want to make ends meet. So the reality on the ground when you go to these oftentimes very poor countries is that it's prostitution, perhaps. So is it better that they pick cocoa than that? Yeah, a lot of families would feel that way, and it's been a couple of hundred years since the situation was such in Denmark, where we use child labor in agriculture and whatnot. But we can still find the stories, and it still happened. We got to be careful that we're not putting ourselves on too high of a horse here in terms of understanding the realities on the ground. What are the options that we offer in terms of developing those countries? So I'm not advocating that we should have child labor, not at all, but I'm saying that what do you put in place of that? I mean, what kind of development ambitions are you, or what kind of help are you providing otherwise to make that development possible so it's not needed anymore?
Yeah, I also hear you sort of advocating a pragmatic approach and look at the situation on the floor.
It's complex and nuanced, actually, when you get down to it.
Yeah. We anthropologists, we love that.
It's super complex, but the only thing I think I would say that I think a lot of people realize using these private certifications is that when you're in a weak governance zone, if you're in a poor country where the courts are not working, where the public sector is not working, it is a little bit of an illusion to think that the private sector is working. Sure, you can get the documentation. Sure, it's maybe better than the alternative, but is it great? Is it good? It's a truth with modifications. When you're in weak governance zones and there is an incentive for not necessarily complying with all parts of the certification, then it becomes tough. Each individual part of the value chain, part of the chain of custody, has an incentive to not comply with these things. So I'm not advocating against it. Again, I'm saying it's nuanced. Having private sectors stand in the place of public sector authority and regulation and so on is not a fix-all. It's not a solution necessarily.
If we look back to the 90s where we had the pioneers, and we can call that the first sustainability wave, where it was a bit of a free-for-all, there wasn't too much of a systematic scrutiny that gave rise to the rise of the certifications, and we saw a whole range of FSC, MSC, CDP, new ISO standards, fair trade, organic labels, all of these things that could kind of provide a certain trust into the market. And now we're seeing a third wave. When do you see the third wave starting or emerging, and what's contained in the third wave?
Well, I think the third wave was sort of it emerged. I would sort of say 6-7 years ago. I think there was a clarity arising that these certifications not going to be the answer. It's too much of a jungle out there for people to understand and comprehend. And rightly, I think companies would ask themselves, is this satisfactory? Are we able to show progress? Are we able to communicate with trust around these issues? And you would find standards would try to accommodate this by trying to be more comprehensive, right? But you would also see the rise of, essentially, if you go back 100 years, financial accounts weren't a certainty. You could not, for sure, know how a company was doing because there were no accounting standards. And what we're seeing now is, for the first time with the EU taxonomy, is you're trying to do a consistent set of accounts for sustainability. Now, this is the first sort of real attempt at trying to make common international standards whereby you, as a outside third party, could evaluate consistently across businesses who's doing what. It's incredibly difficult. Any sort of ESG analyst or rating bureau, the reason we have these rating bureaus is because it's incredibly difficult to tell one company from the other who's doing better. Understanding the scope of what they're reporting on. Is it in the entire company? Is it part of the company that's being reported on?
Is it only 50% owned assets, or where
exactly? It's a whole. It's a humongous challenge to understand company performance. If you set yourself out, I want to understand whether company A is better than company B.
So that
it's tough.
I agree a lot on sort of that third wave where it was kind of. I would say CSR is still existing in kind of parallel, but we see a really fast movement that comes a little bit out of nowhere with the Paris Agreement being signed, and I think a lot of people were quite surprised at that. I remember myself being quite surprised that they agreed on something. What? And it's ambitious and it's international. There was something. There was definitely. A sort of a sign of hope from the Paris. There was a genuine moment right there. And from that spurred the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that were addressing a lot of the same topics as they do in the EU taxonomy. But somehow it appears to me if there's a failed framework between the two, to me at least it's the SDGs. I believe the SDGs are not a very constructive vehicle to go for. What's the difference? What works really well in the taxonomy that doesn't work in the SDGs the way you see it?
I think the jury is still out on the taxonomy, to be honest. And I think when you look into the eyes of people in companies challenged with reporting on the taxonomy, I think right now, at least, it's still early days. But right now, you can see a bewildered look in their eyes. How are we going to manage this? How is this going to happen? How is it going to play out? And I think, to be fair, we have to appreciate that this is the first attempt at setting international standards. Will they get everything right? Absolutely not. Will they need to maybe rebase, rethink certain things? Absolutely, that's to be expected, but it's to be applauded that we now have a consistent framework which is not, which is agnostic. It's not a private company wanting you to buy a certain certification with the inherent problems that drives.
It's actually a continental omelette. And a few eggs have been broken.
So we don't know for sure, how it's going to play out. But I think we have to applaud that there are now some standards, and now it's a question of getting them into the market, and then of course improving on them. I think the SDG is a little bit of a special case because the history is you have the Millennium Development Goals, where you only had a handful of goals, and you had a huge success. You had huge success in achieving the goals because, coalescing a lot of people around, and these were literally very few, 8, and there was not 100 sub-goals. There were 8 goals, end of story. With the SDGs, you have the 18. You have the 18, but under the 18 is around 200. And so it's been a little bit, in the development world, you'll call this a Christmas tree. You see this opportunity, and everybody tries to hang their thing on this vehicle, saying, I want part of it. And that's actually what's, I think, destroyed it, to be honest. I think agreeing on a global scale on achieving, prioritizing certain things and setting a goal for them and then achieving it, I think there's nothing wrong with that. But when you dilute it to the extent it's been diluted here, you miss the focus. People will be hard pressed to say what's KPI number 172. And I compute.
It's a little bit easier to say no hunger, no illiteracy, or no systematic illiteracy that were the millennial goals.
It's suffering from its own success. That too many people wanted too much out of this, and that's what at the end of the day has stymied what could have been. And to some extent, I mean, you can't just dismiss it, but what has maybe is stymieing it in terms of being looked upon as successful, because I think the taxonomy is probably going to take over in terms of what you want to report on, and you could arguably say, well, with the taxonomy, are we looking at the end of certifications, or are we looking at the end of frameworks, external, private frameworks for reporting? A part of me says I hope so.
Yeah.
Because I think it's healthy that we have common standards.
Yeah, I tend to agree, especially when we're looking at sort of the entire mess around ESG and having investment assets having ESG classifications, and also seeing that Bloomberg was stripping so many trillions of dollars worth of investment assets of their ESG ratings, because when they did the audits, they just found that the reporting didn't quite match the reality. And I have a very strong notion that with the SDGs, as you say, it's been a Christmas tree that everybody could hang their sort of decoration on, and there was no accountability at the same time. So you were actually able to just window dress galore, and to me, this was the perfect SDG washing opportunity. Everyone bought into the legitimacy of the framework. There's a UN logo in there. Great. Let's just claim stuff without sort of having to allocate budget, resources, or time. Whereas with the EU taxonomy, it's a reporting framework that is instated by law, and the methodology is going to be relatively strict. One of the things that the ISO standard has done extremely well, in my opinion, is that it's transparent what's going on. It's transparent how you can go there, and there's a reason to believe there will be a drive towards sort of gaining that certification if you're marketing yourself as being ISO compliant with something. And I think for everyone who's working in pharma, this compliance, regulatory compliance as well, is really a part of everyday life. And we see that the bigger the muscle, the more sensitive and also qualified they are to move towards compliance, because it's just something that they have to be compliant. If they're not compliant, they're going to shut down. That's going to be extremely costly. So we just need to be compliant. And with the EU sort of having the bravery and the courage to go out and say, now we're going to have more natural, more true costs factored into the way we run our economy.
Sure. No, I think it's a wonderful tool for accountability, because that's been a little bit of the challenge when you look at these different companies, is they'll be sure to let you know about their flagship initiative. Yeah. And it's great, I'm sure, in many cases. And it's doing no harm at all. On the contrary, it's probably doing a lot of good. But that flagship initiative will not necessarily be indicative of whether the company is actually doing no harm, or even doing good. You cannot judge by that. And actually being able to judge on that, holding companies to account, has been extremely difficult. What part of their turnover are they reporting on? You just don't know. But that hopefully is coming now. That we have an ability to hold companies to account and give credit when credit's due. That's all this framework is meant to do, is make it very clear accountability on what you're doing.
And it helps us as consultants, because we have a new frame of reference that we can sort of reference to with our clients and say, if the sustainability case right here is quantified like this in euro, like this in CO2 equivalents, and the opportunity looks like this. Sure. And that just means that the value propositions that the ones that are interested in the agenda can present to senior management, can present to executive management, that can present to the boards, it's just much more digestible because it comes with a currency. It comes in a language that they're used to communicating in.
Yeah, and I think there's much more fairness in terms of if you do the groundwork, if you are compliant, if you are dotting the I's, crossing the T's, you will be able to distinguish yourself from the ones not doing it. So you'll be able to pass through those efforts and say, well, this is a substantial effort. It is covering the whole footprint of the firm. And in that sense, you can attach more credibility and you can create more trust. So yeah, we're getting closer to having a currency of sustainability with this. Now, it's not the end all of be all, because there are certain things that are still sort of transitioning from. Are we even quantifying it today? What is our impact on society? There are certain things that are still in the early days of being quantified and matured into a framework where we can sort of all reference. And I think for the healthcare for industry, the qualities and how we report on the qualities is going to be important, and reporting even more on that. I mean, and trying to argue the case for why should you have resources? What are you providing in terms of healthcare in the world? I mean, how are you changing people's lives?
Yeah, we need to look into the health economics of it, right? Yeah. That if we're looking at how much health outcome do we get per dollar invested, how much health outcome do we get per CO2 invested?
Yeah. And I think a little bit of tough love would be, saying, well, listen, there needs to be a balance between the impact you're creating. I mean, it's very tough for politicians to put a price on life and put a price on health. But I'm not sure it's helping the healthcare industry not to try and make strides to sort of saying, well, we need to square that circle. We need to provide some guidance on how are we providing health and healthy lives, full and rich lives, and how can we contribute to that? I think there's a lot of mileage in that. At the moment when you're not, you are really at risk of looking to be the one that is holding resources or selling things that may feel expensive. So I think the more literate you make yourselves in terms of understanding, documenting, measuring how you're improving people's lives, I think is key. Is key to in old days we called it license to operate.
Yeah. But that's good consulting lingo.
Yeah. So why should people come work for you? Yeah. Why should you have access to resources? Why should you be able to charge the premium that you charge on your product or on your care? I think the better you articulate that, the more you enable yourself to be able to articulate that, the better you're off in terms of being able to pursue your mission.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Kristoffer, it's been amazing having you here. Thanks a lot for going over the waves and your own journey into quantifying sustainability, and thanks for coming here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Cheers. Thanks for listening in to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. It was an amazing experience to have Kristoffer in here and learn about his journey into professional sustainability, and also to have sort of a session where I could pick his brain on quantifying sustainability the way he sees it. He really is one of the grand old men of sustainability in the Danish ecosystem. So really thankful and grateful to have had Kristoffer in here. Please do remember to tell us what you thought of the episode. Like, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends and colleagues if you found it helpful. Also, please, if there's anyone that you would like for us to have as a guest on the show, let us know. We're quite open to take in guests. Thanks a lot for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes.